Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar titled From Compliance to Competitive Edge, Treasury's Opportunity with ISO 20022. This is Brian from Strategic Treasurer, and we're pleased you could join us as we consider the key challenges, opportunities, and practical steps Treasury teams can take to turn regulatory change into a competitive advantage. Our speakers for today are Mayank Randev, Director Solution Engineering at TIS, and Paul Galloway, Senior Advisor at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Mayank and Paul, and I'll now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. So just want to go through kind of the broad agenda for today. We're going to break it up into foundations, which is getting the basic understanding of what an ISO 20022 file format is. We're also going to talk about timeline because there are some migration components tied to this, some coming up quite soon. We'll also talk about the benefits. And when I do talk about the timeline and a lot of what we do when we go through this presentation, we'll break it up between banks and corporates because they are impacted differently and they have different challenges. And so we'll talk about those things as we move forward. We'll also talk about what the ISO file format is relative to an MT or SWIFT file format that a lot of people are commonly used to, as well as what all these multiple file formats mean. There are a variety of them. We'll talk about those. There's an intersection between them. There's some commonality between them, and we'll address those. We'll also talk about implementation of the ISO file format into your processes and systems. And then we'll close with a few final thoughts, key takeaways from the presentation today. We have a lot of content to go through, so we'll move through it quite quickly or as briskly as we can. And as Brian said, there will be opportunity to ask questions throughout. Don't hesitate. We'll try to address those as best as we can. With that, I'm going to hand over to Mayank for slide 5, which is common language.
Thanks, Paul. So just to introduce what the ISO 20022 standard is, whilst I anticipate it to be common knowledge amongst most of the attendees, so it's more of a refresher for everyone that this standard forms a common language used by financial institutions to exchange messages with each other around financial instruments, essentially payments, securities, etc. It was developed by the International Standards Organization along with experts in the financial industry back in 2004. So it's not necessarily a new standard. However, there has been a historical trend of how that has evolved. And just to take like a short example of why it was important to bring this standard about, one of the things that I like to take as an example is there wasn't a common understanding worldwide of some of these terms, just like in daily life. In Europe, football means something very different to what it does in the US. So similar to that, some of the main drivers behind creating this standard were firstly a fragmentation of different messaging standards in different countries, different terminology, like a beneficiary, a payee, and a creditor could mean exactly the same thing, but they were addressed differently in different regions. Similar to that, the next limitation was that the capacity of the data for individual formats that existed wasn't enough that allowed for automation. And another element was increasing regulatory demands, increasing governance in terms of the data that is being exchanged between banks, between corporates and banks around the area so that there is better governance and controls from a risk perspective. On the other side, the looking at it from a futuristic perspective. We are living in a globalized and a digitalized world, and there was obviously an additional need for automation. We are moving away from paper-based transactions, of course, globally, and all the technological advancements required something that would allow for a global interoperability across systems. And all of these reasons are what led to the development of this standard. Whilst this standard has been, the uptake has been kind of there. Some local payment infrastructures are natively ISO 20022 compliant, like SEPA, whilst others are adopting it. However, at this stage, we are at a very key milestone because come November, there is a shift in the industry where SWIFT, which is, of course, the backbone of interbank communication, is migrating all of its cross-border interbank messaging for payments and reporting, also called CBPR Plus, to this standard. With that introduction, over to you, Paul, to throw some more light on this journey and talk us through what the timeline looks like.
Thanks, Maya. So what we're going to cover here is, what are some of the compliance items that banks and corporates have to adhere to. And so the first important time on this line is November of this year. Banks need to support the ISO file format by this November of 2025 date. Because SWIFT is going to do away with the MT support for the banks. Now, that doesn't mean that clients can't still utilize the file format. They have much longer runway to change over to ISO file format. So by Q4 of this year, SWIFT will require that all banks are sending and receiving ISO 20022 messages. And over at least the target over the next 5 to 6 years, or by 2029, 2030, somewhere in there, they want to have the majority of corporates transition over to utilizing the ISO file format. We're going to dive deeper into what the benefits of doing this are later in the presentation. There are some clear benefits, and we'll distinguish what those benefits are. By 2030, there'll be a phase out of the MT file format. So these are dates that you just need to be aware of and keep in the back of your mind. With that, we're going to move to our first poll question. So our first poll question today is preparation for migration. How prepared is your organization for the November 2025 ISO 20022 migration? It's a single choice: fully prepared, somewhat prepared, not very well prepared, not at all prepared, or unsure. And if we get 100 participants to type in TIS in the chat box, we'll send out the results of the polls to everyone. We need 100 to type in TIS in the chat box to do that. So when I think about this, there may be some folks that haven't thought about the migration to date. So certainly understand if folks haven't put this on the radar screen right now. If you're a bank and you're on this webinar, certainly something I think has been on the radar screen. Corporates, I think it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of this is.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also quite intrigued to see where the audience sees their organizations.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mayank. And so we got the results here. Look at that. About a quarter of the folks on here are unsure. Not surprised by that. Quite a few are somewhat prepared. Some are fully prepared. And a little bucket there, about 20% that either are not prepared at all or not very prepared. So I think, this presentation that we have today, the webinar, will provide, I hope, some better understanding, better feedback, and help folks think about preparation. So with that, I think we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is impact of migration.
Yeah. So as you said at the beginning, Paul, the impact is slightly different when it comes to banks versus corporates. And that's why I've divided this into two parts. When it comes to banks, of course, it is predominantly about operational complexity. Banks have systems which are legacy, if I can use that word, which have been around for many years, and all the challenges or all the drivers of this standard also apply to those legacy systems. And this is really a, a large operational element to ensure that their systems are ready to migrate over to this new standard to be able to fully use the rich data set that is provided. It also actually provides a strategic opportunity for banks because this is really a driver for them to finally make that change into migrating and modernizing their infrastructure to become more digital and to enhance their operations through customer insights. When it comes to corporates, of course, it's there is no immediate deadline, which actually leads to some element of uncertainty, but there's also urgency because there is definitely going to be a point when corporates will have to move over as well. And better now than later is what I would suggest. But then, of course, the impact is in terms of technical adjustments that they have to make. There are also systems and landscapes within corporate infrastructures like ERP systems, which may not be ready to meet those requirements. And also, taking an example, there is a requirement for having structured addresses in the new pane one, a payment instruction file or message that many ERP systems don't store the data in that way, and hence that is a technical adjustments that they will have to make. So in conclusion, the migration is not just about banks, but the corporates need to be ready as well to send and receive ISO 20022 messages and to not only comply as we state in the title, but also to be able to fully reap the benefits of that, which we will come to in a bit. So with that, I hand over to you, Paul, to talk a bit more about this.
Thanks, Mayank. I'm gonna cover comply or transform. Before I do that, just had a question come through the chat. Do we share a copy of the presentation? We will do that post-webinar. I believe that will come out sometime on Tuesday next week, but we will get that out there. Okay, so once again we broke this up between banks and corporates. We're trying to provide visibility to how this impacts both and what that means for both. And so you can see we've got compliance only. They could choose to just do the basic compliance of the transitioning, or they could view it as more transformational. So for the banks, they have to comply. So at a minimum, they have to get transitioned over. I believe that there will be quite a few banks that are going to leverage their own infrastructure and also take the opportunity to position themselves from a transformational opportunity. It would be an upgrade to their systems. This would be something new that they would offer to their customers. There will be banks that will take that opportunity. A lot of the tier one banks invest quite heavily into technology. So it makes sense that you'll probably see something from a bank perspective. When it comes to corporates, I think a number of corporates are expected to complete at least the minimal or no upgrades in terms of compliance and utilizing their systems or relying on their bank. It could be that you have a TMS platform or payment platform that will bring the corporate into compliance, or just relying on the bank themselves. So it would be pretty minimal in terms of effort, but some corporates may seek to centralize their platforms, for a broader transformational upgrade. This may be a movement from bank portals to systems. It could be something else that the corporates are doing. But I think from a standpoint of compliance alone, there will be minimal effort for the corporates. With that said, I do have one question that just came in. Is there a deadline requirement on all U.S. banks to be able to process all payments types, ACH, web, I assume telephone, CCD, etc., via ISO? So for the banks, and we'll talk more around the file formats later in terms of payments, but the banks do have to have that compliance. The target is Q4 this year to have that turned over. So they will have to do that. Now, does that mean that customers are going to have to utilize that file format immediately? No, they won't have to, but there will be a point in time where the MT file formats will go away. There are some distinct benefits to using an ISO 20022 file format that we'll talk about later as well, that I think will help shed some light on that. Mayank, if there's anything I missed in response to that question, just please chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to very quickly highlight the differences in the type of payments that were listed there, right? Because, of course, when we talk about the migration, currently the November deadline is specific to the interbank cross-border payments, which typically go over SWIFT. I say typically because there are other ways banks can communicate, but typically the correspondent banking network is using MT standards, so the MT 202, for example, and those will go away. However, when it comes to domestic payments, even there is a change happening with the interbank communication. Each country has adopted the standard or is adopting the standard at a different pace, and that is something that the banks are obviously aware of and taking necessary actions. But as you rightly said, the corporate to bank communication, and that is the uncertain part, is still on a case-by-case basis. Some banks are mandating that corporates start sending them the XML formats, whilst the others are still going to accept the MT, and the other way around as well, where the statements might get, the statements you get from banks might not be the MT 940 anymore. I saw a question in the Q&A as well on that topic. So basically the formats for the statements currently, it's bank dependent, so that each bank decides what they want to do. Some banks are even offering paid services for those transformations when it comes to statements. But the interbank communication for the cross-border payments is definitely changing.
Thanks,
Hopefully
Mayank.
that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Mayank. I think that helps address a few of the questions that we've had out there. With that, we'd like to move to our second poll question that we have today. And again, just as a reminder, if we get 100 participants to type TIS in the chat box, we will send out the results of the surveys along with a copy of the presentation. So if you haven't done that, I invite you to go ahead and type that into the chat box. So our second poll question is around biggest opportunities. which areas do you see as the biggest opportunities for ISO 20022 adoption? You can select more than one. It's multiple choice. There are no wrong answers in this case, but you can select more than one. Is it improved payment processing? Is it enhanced cash visibility and forecasting? Better compliance and risk management? Streamline reconciliation? Improved analytics and decision making? Other or unsure? And we haven't dove into the benefits necessarily, but maybe this gives you a little idea around what benefits might be available with transitioning to this file format. And I've had several projects I've worked on for clients that are implementing new payment platforms or TMS, and a lot of them are wanting to move towards the newer file formats for payments and for information reporting. They're transitioning already to the ISO file format through these implementations of new platforms and systems. So we'll see what folks come up with here in terms of the ones that they believe will apply for the biggest opportunities. All right. Improved payment processing shows up number one. Almost 2/3 of the people followed on that, and followed by 3 that were kind of neck and neck. Enhanced visibility, forecasting, compliance, and risk management, reconciliation. There is a small group of unsure, a small group of improved analytics and decision making. I think folks really hit on some of the main points of what some of the benefits are we're going to talk about. I do believe that you're going to find that there will be improved visibility, processing, and reconciliation, as well as compliance. So not surprised, not too surprised by the results here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to move to the next slide. Mayank's going to take the next two. We're going to jump into the benefits.
Yeah, so that ties very well to the poll results as well. And I think the key benefits that we foresee, and this is actually across both banking and corporate processing, is around the transparency, automation opportunities, as well as operational resilience. So if I take an example of the new format, which is the ISO 20022 payment format, it has specific fields that determine things like what is the purpose of the payment, a reference number, which could be an invoice number, a specific creditor reference, which clearly shows that who is the payment for, what is the purpose, what is the amount, what is the invoice against which it is being paid. This was not possible in the old MT formats, and hence it creates greater transparency when a payment lands at the processing unit. The second part, if I continue the example of that, is around automation. And payments, of course, once they are processed by the bank and the bank sends back a statement to the corporate who has initiated that payment, it is much easier for matching of receivables. For example, if you have outstanding invoices that you need to match against, it was harder using the unstructured data that was available in the statements like the MT format, whereas in the new CAMT format, it would be much easier. And then finally, when it comes to the operational resilience, something like screening payments for sanctions is faster and more accurate because the system doesn't need to parse unstructured text. So again, when it comes to payment systems, they would have to be customized to read text and read between the lines, if I can say that, to determine if there was a potential risk of a sanctioned party being paid. And with the more structured information that helps with streamlining that process and fewer false positives, because obviously
Right.
banks are risk averse and they would want to scan everything. With this, there is a higher straight through processing possible. Moving to the additional benefits that you've highlighted here, of course, are around improving reconciliation capabilities. These are, again, more for treasury operations now, where a corporate treasurer would need to ensure that their invoices have been paid and then they can release goods. Uh, it also supports working capital improvements. The structured data ensures that both inbound and outbound payments can be allocated, and then you can have future flows associated with those payments. And then finally, corporates can use on behalf of payments capabilities using the ISO 20022 format, making it a native feature, whereas in the past, they would have to do something on top for them to be allowed to make on behalf of payments. Here, just by by effect of adding that information in the payment instruction, corporates can allow for that flexibility to make payments to or to allow third parties to make payments on their behalf. All of this, in a sense, allows banks to be more agile and automated, but also corporates to have a more streamlined and resilient operation when it comes to their entire treasury and cash management and liquidity planning. So that's, in a nutshell, the key benefits that we foresee. And with that, I want to hand over to you, Paul, to take us through a little bit more in depth into the individual features of those messages that I just talked about.
Thanks, Mayank. I appreciate that. I did get a question in asking if we were recording this. We are recording that, the webinar, so will be a copy or access to rewatch the webinar afterwards. So just to let folks know that. Okay, so I like to call this slide alphabet soup because we've got a lot of letters and trying to make sense of it all. There's a lot going on. So what I thought I would do is start over on the right-hand side and focus on the MT file formats, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with or have heard them. I'm just going to go ahead and go through them because what I want to be able to do is map it over to what the ISO file formats are. They're shown in the green over on the left-hand side. So in order to do that, let's just start with an MT101. That is a high value payment, like a wire or batch of payments. It can be done either between corporate and a bank or between two banks. An NT103 is a single payment between two banks, so it's like a transfer of funds. So when we look at MT940, this is information reporting, it's prior day file, and MT942, that's a current day file. And so that kind of gives you the groundwork between payments and information reporting. So what does all that mean? Well, going over to the left-hand side, we'll start with XML. Over there, we've got UBL, which is tied to supply chain and commerce, FPML, which is for derivatives, FIXML, which is trading messages, and XBRL, which is financial reporting. And so an XML file is like a flat file. An ISO 20022 is also a flat file. The far left, you see we got JSON in the blue there. That is JavaScript object notation, which can be used for APIs. So API connection, transfer information, that's what that can be utilized for. And so in the middle is kind of the overlap between XML and ISO 20022. This is where you kind of bring those file formats together, and we look at what the payments are and what the information reporting is. And so those ones that say PAIN or pain.001, that is similar to an MT101. So that would be for those wires or batch payments. And then a pain.08 is similar to an MT103. So it's more of that single payment between two banks, a transfer. So those are the payment files, kind of making that relationship between what Swift has and transition to the ISO 20022 for payments. On the information reporting side, there's that CAMT or CAMT. So the CAMT 052, that replaces the MT 942 or the current day files. And the CAMT 053 is for replaces the MT 940, and that's prior day files. When we think about or we look at the CAMT 054, didn't talk about that one in terms of the MTs. That will replace the MT 900, the 910 that some people may be familiar with. So that would be debit and credit notifications. And so that will replace those MTs. And so there's a whole bunch of alphabet soup here that, I just wanted to be able to give some nomenclature or grounding to, so that when you see these file formats and you aren't exactly sure what they are, you can look at them out on the web, or you can refer back to the webinar presentation here and understand what those are. So MT messaging. So what are some of the limitations associated with the MT messaging? So MT messages allows for 4 lines up to 35 characters each. So that's the total incumbents of what you can have in that particular message. Doesn't matter what particular MT message you're sending, this is what the threshold is. So you can have payment details in there. You can have some free-form text that are shown in the middle, we point out, for information to ERPs or bank apps. Or you also have some unstructured fields to provide that don't provide enough transparency for complex payments. And so that's what you get with the MTs. These have been solid, tried and true, but as things have evolved over time, complexity of payments, the complexity of systems, and the need for more information and data, the MT messaging just isn't providing enough. And so it's limiting in its structure. When we look at the ISO file format, there is much more opportunity to provide detailed information, and you can break it out within the messaging, and the limitations are much less. So it is certainly much different than what the MT file format is. Being a flat file, you can have dedicated fields for payment purposes. So as an example, you can show it against a customer invoice. That's what we're showing in this particular slide here. So you can show it against a customer invoice. You can reference the unique portions of the invoice. Anything that's tied to the ERP, information that the ERP would need, supplier's unique reference from the invoice, the remittance information. It can be repetitive, can contain multiple documents. And you can also, for instances where people are still working with the MT file format, you can truncate the ISO XML file for receivers so that they get it in a file format that they're currently working with in transition to the ISO. So you can continue to use the Swift MT formats, and it won't cause, it will still work for you, but and using or continuing to use the Swift NT file formats, it will cause some reconciliation errors as industry shifts to the ISO file format. Different information, amount of information, the way it's presented. So there will be a bit of a transition period, and we do expect there'll be some reconciliation errors along the way that folks will have to work through. With that, we're going to move to our third poll question. And this one's going to be around support. What support would be most valuable for solution providers as you navigate ISO 20022? This again is multiple choice. Select all that apply. Implementation guidance and best practices. Technology and system integration support. Training and education for staff. Ongoing monitoring and optimization, or other, or unsure. So you think about what support would be most valuable, what in particular is most important to you and your company out of the list that we have here. Mayank, I could think of some things that would be important to me as a practitioner. When I was a practitioner, I certainly had certain areas I like to focus on more than others. I wonder if for certain corporates or even banks are on this call, if areas are more important to them versus other areas. I would think there would be a couple that might stand out here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really depends a lot on the internal operations in the setup. Some corporates are more tech savvy than others, but at the same time, it also depends on how big or large they are. So yeah, that's a good divide, I would say.
Yeah, this is not real surprising. The
Yeah.
first three are kind of almost in line. The first one, implementation guides and best practices. That totally makes sense. Ongoing monitoring and optimization. I think this is going to be part of practice that folks are going to go through. Certainly, hopefully by the end of this presentation, folks that are kind of unsure, maybe it starts to get people thinking and provides them some good background support for what they're going to do going forward and thinking about the ISO 20022 file format and transitioning. Any other thoughts, Mayank, you might have?
Yeah, so I think the poll definitely is revealing the status in terms of there is a lot of uncertainty still, especially when it comes to the corporate side, and there is a need for support at all levels. So that's definitely good to know. I do want to highlight that there were some questions in the chat and the Q&A that I will try and cover in the subsequent slides, and then maybe come back to them as we do the key takeaways as well. So if you asked a question, it's not that we're ignoring you. We'll come to those in a bit.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Mayank. We probably will have a little bit of time at the end of this presentation to come back to some of those questions. Again, if we don't get to everyone's questions, we're going to filter through those post-call, and you'll receive a response to your question. So, as Mayank said, don't feel like we're ignoring you. We're not. We will address all questions that are presented. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Mayank for statement translation.
Yep. Thanks. So I took this as a use case just to illustrate support and to also illustrate strategies that, especially when it comes to your corporate treasury operations, what you could do. There was actually a comment or a question in the Q&A, which was about uncertainty about, until everything is moved, is it going to be uncertain? Absolutely. And that's something that uh, is unfortunately determined from a bank to bank perspective. Each bank is obviously focused more on ensuring their interbank communication is handled well. Uh, but then also from a corporate standpoint, each corporate is at a different place in their journey. And what a translation engine like this one can support you with is to, whilst the objective of the migration is to standardize the communication, as I said, we are still not there, especially when it comes to the communication between the banks and the corporates. And in this example, there is a common strategy that corporates are undertaking and adopting to streamline their operations with minimal disruptions, whilst also leveraging the benefits of the ISO 20022 message formats. And it is to centralize their bank connectivity through a payments and statements engine, especially when it comes to a complex multi-country, multi-bank, multi-region landscape where you have banks across the globe uh, and operations across the globe, and also a very potentially dynamic internal systems landscape. So you might have an ERP landscape, which is diverse. You might have a treasury management system. And it's a matter of balancing both those elements, the bank side as well as the backend systems that you operate. And taking a concrete example of a corporate who have, let's say, an SAP ERP system, which is an older version in ECC. Actually, there was a question about SAP. That's why I take that as an example. And that particular system, ECC natively only reads the old MT formats, and they might be migrating to the new S4 HANA, which actually is a natively ISO 20022 compatible version of the ERP. So whilst migrating, of course, there is a need for an interim solution where you might want to have coexistence of both those formats. And a central statement translation or conversion engine enables the corporate to accept statements in multiple formats from different banks in MT and CAMT, and helps you to potentially translate those into a harmonized single format that the backend systems can support, or it could be multiple formats. So you receive CAMT formats from your banks, but you want to send an MT940 to your SAP system. And that centralization removes the complexity from your ERP as well as from your banking landscape. So you can have a solution that is not just meeting your immediate tactical need, but it is also future-proof because there could be further changes that happen in terms of those formats. It is also well known that whilst we are talking about standardization and 80% of those formats are standardized, banks may still use different versions of those formats. And this is not just a middleware solution, just to highlight, right? Because there is a business transformation capability inbuilt into that translation engine. For instance, ability to configure rules for transformation. So again, an example where different banks might send formats which have the remittance information in different fields of the same CAMT message, or they might still be sending you an empty format, but you want to convert that into a XML format. The translation engine allows you to define rules to transform those message formats into not just CAMT or MT, but also potentially a JSON format, making it future-proof as well. So this example I wanted to highlight specifically for treasury operations, because when it comes to reconciliation specifically, a lot of corporates have spent a lot of effort and resources in building logic such that their backend systems can work with specific formats like the MT940. Now, of course, whilst you do want to transform, you also don't want to disrupt, at least in the interim phase. And that is a first step towards ensuring that you can do it in a more seamless way. And this example is about statements. And if I extrapolate that, it's also true that you could use this similar structure for payments, having a centralized payment system that can support the conversion and transformation. You talked about the structured address. There was also a question in the chat about what will happen if the data is not in a structured way uh, sent to the bank. How would the banks reject that? It's again a bank-to-bank perspective. Some banks might charge you extra if such messages are received. They will not reject it, but there might be some banks who will reject it. So there are these possibilities, and a transformation engine like that enables you to have that seamless movement such that even if your ERP system is not ready with structured address information, that translation engine can help you translate the payment messages into the right format for the bank. So in conclusion, a central payments or statements hub can support corporates in ensuring that they can make necessary technical adjustment with the least disruption to their core operations. In a sense, they will outsource the complexity to an expert. So with that, we can move to the next topic, which is around steps that you need to take for a successful implementation. As we said, we will share all the content and the slides from here. So there is a lot of information here. And rather than going through each point, I just want to touch on the first couple of points here, the first and the fourth to be specific. Again, to answer some of the questions in the chat and the Q&A, the assessment of your current systems, if you're using a particular treasury management system, is it capable of supporting multiple formats at the same time, or is there a need for change? If you have your ERP systems, checking your internal processes and systems is really the first step, and also assessing the banks, and you can't highlight that enough, in my opinion. And then, of course, the fourth point here is about involving stakeholders. The earlier, the better, in order to use that as an opportunity to transform processes as well, right? Because as we want to highlight, it's not just about ticking the box. It's about looking at your processes and seeing how you can make them better and more resilient. And that is the opportunity by involving everyone within the organization to ensure that you take the right steps. So, Paul, I guess you can also highlight some of the other important parts on the right side about
Yeah,
the
over on the right
implementation.
side, I'm just gonna kind of sum it up at a high level because I think the process to get to implementation is your team needs to have good core understanding, so you need to train them. You also need to map the data. You need to understand the flows between systems, between third parties. You need to know what's going to be impacted, who's going to be impacted by the change. And you got to have a plan. How are you going to migrate? What's that look like? Phased approach to doing it, I think, is something that folks are going to want to do. And of course, testing and retesting to make sure everything works and functions properly from front end to back end. So it's payment initiation to reconciliation, making sure that the whole process works. Of course, you're going to have to monitor and optimize over time. It's just part of transitioning to anything that's new. And this certainly will be new for some organizations. So with that, we'd like to move to some of the final thoughts. And Mayank, I'll turn it over to you to handle the first two on the left, and I'll handle the other two on the right.
Yeah, sure. And this is just to reiterate the final thoughts in terms of summarizing how um, that affects you as an organization, right? So one is about assessing the situation. Of course, from a corporate standpoint, you need to ensure your banking setup is analyzed. there are ways that you can do that. Of course, engaging with experts could be one of those, but also internal assessment of your landscape and your systems. And when it comes to banks, of course, the first step, most of the banks are ready for the for the cross-border banking communication. The next steps is really about how does that translate to a customer experience. I would encourage banks to engage with their corporate customers to also give them education on that area, proactively inform them if they are going to make changes to what their kind of future state would look like, so corporates can better prepare for that. When it comes to the transitioning itself, it's a trade-off sometimes, right? Of course, it's idealistic to think that everything can be transformational, but every corporate and bank are on a different journey, so you can decide what your transition should look like, whether you want to first comply and then think of it from a transformational perspective, because there could be cost elements involved, or do you want to directly take the leap and rejig all your processes and reap all the benefits that you get with this migration? All
Thanks,
over to
Mayank.
you.
Thanks, Mayank. Appreciate that. So on the benefits side, think about more data, getting more transparency, the ability to automate things, as well as gaining operational efficiencies. This is going to help improve reconciliation. It's going to make it easier. It's going to make it better. You're going to have a lot more detailed information. Instead of 4 lines of 35 characters at each line, you're going to be able to get to the detail of what the payment is, even down to an invoice number or other information. So we see reconciliation being improved quite a bit. This will also help you on the working capital side of things, as you're able to get things deciphered in terms of what these payments are, either coming in or going out. You're going to see some improved working capital visibility. In terms of payments, the ability to do cross-border payments or on behalf of payments, that is a good capability, as well as the complexity of the payment. It can handle complex payments instead of shoving it into a very limited amount of information. You can have quite a bit of information in the ISO 20022 file. So I think you're going to find that these benefits are going to be across organizations. I think banks will find it beneficial as well. So it's not just corporates, but I think banks will find it beneficial as well. It's going to make it easier on both sides to decipher what's going on with a particular payment and troubleshoot. So I think these are key benefits. When it comes to implementation, Mayank did a nice job of providing an example of the statement translation. There are other structures you could see in terms of translation. That's a good basic view of what that might look like. Your systems, understanding system capabilities today, what you can do within the system. You may have to talk to your provider. They may be working on transition over to handle the ISO file format. They may have already done it. You may already be utilizing it. But getting that basic core understanding of system capabilities and what systems will be impacted will be important. Of course, training your folks, making sure that they have a good core understanding of what this means will be important. A phased approach, I talked about that earlier for your migration plan. Do it in a phased approach. You don't have to do everything all at once. Make sure you're thoughtful in what you're doing, phase it out appropriately, and based on priority. Of course, testing, like with anything that's going to be new for an organization, new system, new capabilities, you got to test and probably retest. And of course, know that over time, there will be updates as things continue to advance. With that, we've got about 5 minutes left. One thing I wanted to go back to, I did see a question pop up again around timeline, just so that folks know for corporates, you don't have to transition over to utilizing the ISO file format for some time. The idea for what's going to happen on the Swift side, if you're using MTs for payments and information reporting, by 2030, the target is to phase out the MT file formats. So you do have some time to get the to transition over. So it's not something as a corporate you got to do immediately. The banks have to comply sooner. They have to be able to handle the ISO file format a lot sooner. That'll help with the transitioning for corporates. Some clients will benefit because they'll be able to lean on or leverage their banks. You'll also see that some of your third-party partners systems will be able to transition over to the file format as well. So with that, I just wanted to go back and see other questions we might have out there. Brian, if you have something on your list immediately as I'm going through the chat, I just want to try to make sure we've addressed questions there.
I think just whilst we do that, I just want to highlight that most of the questions in the Q&A that came in, I tried to address in the example. However, if there is something that you feel is unanswered, you can type your question in again.
I think there was a question on CBE credits, and there will be credits available. This is a learning presentation, learning webinar, and so there will be that ability. And Brian, I believe you're going to send something out on that post, the webinar, correct? Yep. Okay, Brian just confirmed that. Great. Okay. I know there were some people that said they weren't able to answer the third poll question. I don't think that will impact anything in terms of CPE credits, so I wouldn't be worried about that, but that's noted. We can see that. Okay.
I think there was another question, just to quickly address that in terms of banks which are sending reference data to another bank. Typically, if it is within the cross-border space where banks are using SWIFT to make cross-border payments, they are mandated to move to the new formats. Of course, they might still have slight variations, but they are mandated to move to that. So the interbank communication by November should move. We are right now in what is called as the coexistence phase, where both MT and MX formats have existed together. And then as a related point about the deadline, at some point, banks will start mandating corporates to start sending information in those specific formats, even though the deadline might be later, because that reduces their overheads, or they might start charging for those conversions. So that is why potentially a payment that was highlighted that a payment didn't have the structured information was stopped by a bank. We are likely to see more of that if, because banks will start slowly transitioning, and that's why it's important to assess how the transition works for your individual bank.
All right. With that, moving to the last slide, I'll turn it over to you, Brian, to close it out. Appreciate everybody being on the webinar today. Thanks, Mayank.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayank. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The CTP credits, today's webinar slides, and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you within 5 business days. And for more on ISO 20022, be sure to listen to the Treasury Update Podcast, episode 372 with Mayank by clicking the link in the chat box. Thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.